Today is November 28th. Happy Monday. And on this episode of The Shituation, we are going to be discussing the murder weapon in the quadruple homicide of 4 University of Idaho students, and that is a knife. So let's get into it. The coroner in this case confirmed on November 17th that all 4 of the victims died from multiple stab wounds, and she even said that some of the victims had defensive wounds, though no further details were elaborated on as to how many of the victims had defensive wounds or who those victims with defensive wounds were, though we know from statements made by Zaina's father that she is one of the victims that had defensive wounds. Police have stated that they are looking for a Rambo-style knife, and for those of y'all who don't know what that is, it's a knife that's about 1 foot in total length that doesn't fold. We know from what police have released that the murder weapon was not located at the scene. The type of knife, as well as the fact that the knife was not located at the crime scene, tells us 2 things. 1, the style of the knife tells us that this wasn't a crime of opportunity where someone just grabbed what was available to them at arm's length, such as a kitchen knife. This is a specialized knife typically used by hunters and outdoorsmen. The second thing it tells us is that the style of the knife, in conjunction with the fact that it wasn't found at the crime scene, tells us that the killer both brought the murder weapon with them to the scene as well as left the scene with the murder weapon. In an effort to help identify the hands that held that knife, as well as a better idea of the exact murder weapon used, investigators contacted local businesses to determine if a fixed blade style knife had been recently purchased at any of their establishments, and it appears from what has been said that no further information was provided by local businesses as to a recent purchase of that style knife at their establishment. On November 17th, the coroner also stated that there were no signs of sexual assault on any of the victims. Though there was no sign of sexual assault on any of the victims, thank God, in criminology there is a thing called piquerism. Piquerism is a sexual interest in penetrating the skin of another person with a sharp object. Sometimes this is in a non-lethal sense, but other times it is very much in a lethal manner. Piquerism is a paraphilia as well as a form of sadism, and most frequently the targeted areas of the body are what you would expect, the areas located in the chest, upper torso area, as well as the buttocks and growing area on the victim's body. And we know from what the coroner in this particular case has said that the 4 victims had fatal hits to the upper torso and chest area. Essentially, piquerism can be a replacement for the sexual act itself, where the killer is sexually gratified from the act of stabbing someone. So just because the victims were not sexually assaulted in the traditional sense of the word, that doesn't completely rule out that there was no sexual element to this crime, given that from a criminology standpoint, we know that piquerism could be a potential element in this case. It can also suggest that the killer is, perhaps has some sexual inabilities in their personal life, and I'm not saying that this is the case here. However, I do think it's something to keep in mind until we have further details about this case. The police have also stated from day one, and still stand by this statement today, that these were a targeted attack. Officers using the phrase targeted attack gives the general public a false confidence that they have information about the murders that not only suggest that they are targeted, but that they have an idea of whom the victims were the target of. That statement, given since the beginning of this investigation, is one reason why the general public has been so upset when they didn't have an arrest within a few days, and then a few weeks, and now we are on day 15, still without an arrest in this case. However, just because the statement targeted attack is suggestive that they have an idea of why the victims were targeted and perhaps by whom, doesn't mean that it was the intended message officers were trying to make to the public with that statement. That's just how the public took it. Let me explain. Officers saying it was a targeted attack could also be suggestive of other things. The use of a knife as the weapon of choice in this quadruple homicide gives us some insight into several aspects of this case, including why officers consider this to be a targeted attack. A knife attack is a very personal and messy attack for a perpetrator to execute upon a victim. In 2021, there were 24,576 homicides in the United States, according to the CDC. Only 1,035 of those homicides were committed with a knife or cutting instrument used as the weapon of choice. That means only 4% of the total homicides committed last year in the United States were done by the method of stabbing the victim. And Moscow, Idaho, where this quadruple homicide occurred, hasn't had a homicide since 2016, just for perspective. Additionally, statistics don't support someone's first attack being a quadruple homicide by stabbing. That is more suggestive of an emotional buildup or something someone has been planning or fantasizing about over a period of time. The killer did not just wake up and decide, yeah, I'm gonna go commit a quadruple homicide today. Like, that did not happen. That did not happen, more likely than not. The statistics for that being the situation are slim to none. More likely than not, given what we have been told so far about this case and the circumstances of this case, it seems like the perpetrator has either been thinking about this for a while, like I just said, or that there's been some type of emotional buildup that brewed over on November 13th, which is suggestive of a targeted attack. We know that there were 3 female victims and 1 male victim who was not a full-time resident of the home. He was staying with his girlfriend, though it's been said that he was a frequent flyer. He did basically live there, but he didn't officially live there. And as far as the term targeted attack goes, this could suggest that Ethan, the male victim, was merely in the wrong place at the wrong time, potentially. Another thing which we have no information on at this point in time, but would be extremely relevant in making a statement such as this being a targeted attack, is the injuries that the victims sustained and the order in which they were killed. Both of which, again, I can't speak to as there is no verified information out on those particular points in this case. What I can say, generally speaking, is that if one of the victims sustained a more vicious attack, their injuries were more noticeably substantial, that could and would be suggestive that they were the intended target, which would be further substantiated by evidence at the scene. Though again, at this time, we do not know if police believe this was a targeted attack upon one or multiple of the victims. However, if there was a primary target in this attack, it is unclear why the other 3 victims would have been collateral damage, being that they were in different rooms on multiple levels of the home, which we know from the coroner's statement that said, and I quote, "The bodies of the 4 victims were found in their beds." There is also a lot of questions online about DNA at the scene, and the knife also gives us some possible insight into that aspect of the crime scene and case as well. More common than not in a stabbing death, the perpetrator accidentally injures themselves, aka cuts themselves, and this occurs due to the brutality typically involved in a stabbing death. The perpetrator can typically injure themselves in several ways, so let's talk about that. When a knife hits bone or cartilage, the result of that is an abrupt stop in momentum, which causes the hand of the perpetrator to slide down the knife and cut the killer's hand. Now, the style knife officers are looking for in this case has a hand guard, which is a little platform between the blade and the handle designed to keep your hand from doing that, but it doesn't mean that it's 100% injury proof. Another way injury can occur is that the killer will typically hold down or grab their victim with one hand while using the other hand to stab. And if the victim is fighting against their attacker, it can cause the attacker to accidentally stab their own hand that they are using to subdue or hold down the victim. With a folding style knife, the killer can have the knife fold in on them, which results in them cutting their hand. But of course, that's not applicable here because that's not the style knife that officers are saying was used as the murder weapon. A knife can also become lodged in the victim or the flooring behind the victim, and then the killer has to regrip to dislodge the knife, and that is something that can also cause the killer to accidentally cut themselves in the process of pulling the knife out and dislodging it from whatever it is lodged into. Another scenario that could lead to a killer potentially causing themselves unintended injury is if the attacker was trying to stab their victim and missed, or the victim deflected the attempt, redirecting the attempted blow, which results in the attacker accidentally glancing themselves with the knife. And of course, in a struggle for control of the weapon, the attacker can also accidentally get harmed during the midst of all of that as well. So that's just some examples of ways that a perpetrator can accidentally harm themselves during the commission of the crime. Now, when we apply that to this particular case, the odds of any of those possibilities is only amplified by the circumstances of this case, because there's not one, not two, not three, but 4 victims in this case, all stabbed to death, and that means that the killer's DNA is potentially and more likely than not at the crime scene. If that DNA sample exists, then investigators will have the ability to run that DNA in CODIS to see if they can get a potential hit on the killer or a relative of the killer. And DNA is nothing without a suspect to compare it to, but it is everything when investigators believe they have found their killer. The statements made about the murder weapon also gives us the ideology that police are looking for one suspect. Police have released, as I stated earlier, that they are looking for a Rambo-style knife, one singular murder weapon, which is suggestive of one individual killer. Now, this does not rule out the possibility of multiple people being involved, but is merely suggestive given that there is only one murder weapon, the greater probability of there being one killer. The police may not have given what the public deems as enough information in this case. However, there is more information in what police have given us than meets the eye, especially when it comes to the murder weapon. And on that note, that's it for the knife, and I will see you all on the next episode.